Hey guys, so I was just reading an article on rock and ice, and it was about a bowline coming untied from a very experienced climber. She was actually just taking a quick top rope lap on a easy route for herself just for the sake of warming up, and because of the quality of rope and how loosely she tied her bowline, it came undone while she was on the route. Now luckily she was perfectly fine and didn't have any sort of trips to the hospital or adverse health effects, but it brought up a different form on which bowline you should use to tie in. And unlike the figure eight, there's a bunch of different ways to tie in with a bowline, and so I wanted to make a quick video on different ways to tie in with a bowline and which ways I prefer and what I usually use them for. There are a couple benefits to bowline over the figure eight. The big one is that it is easier to untie after you fall on it quite a bit. And I have myself and also have friends who use a bowline when sport climbing, just because it is easier to untie after you've been working really hard on your route. And I have a specific type of bowline I like to tie in with because I think it's nicer, and I personally tie in the same way, and I always have to check both my partner and I also check myself to make sure I've tied in properly, because there have been a lot of incidents with bowlines. Most famous one is probably Lynn Hill. She writes about this in her book about having her bowline come untied because she never actually finished tying it, and she fell 80 feet and luckily is still alive today. So I'm just going to talk about the different ways to tie in with the bowline and the different ideas among the communities about each way to tie in and which I prefer, and I hope you get something out of this video. Alright, so the first way to tie in with a bowline is just the standard way, and you guys have all seen this in any knots tying book. It's the way that you tend to use more as sailors, and that's just the very standard single bowline. The way I tie this is I start from the bottom loop, bring it up through the top loop, and you have just a little bit of tail going through, and then I cross the end over my tie-in point, and I bring it through, making a loop. Then I can take the end and trace it around the main line again, and then go right back through the loop, and then I have a bowline. Now there are other ways to tie this. That's the way I prefer because it's the easiest way. It's also the way how you learn to do it while caving or in the dark, because you can do this without actually seeing, without actually watching your hands as you tie it. And so some people will just climb with a bowline like this, and then that's it. This is not recommended by anything that I've found, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it myself because this is really easy to come untied. All you need is this to bump a little bit, work itself loose, and especially if you don't have any tension here or it's going from tension to untension, you can actually have this work itself out. And then once you get to this point, there's no point to even be tied in. So having your bowline just tied single bowline with whatever amount of tail, I would not recommend, and I have not met anyone who would recommend tying in with only this knot. Now some people will add in a double fisherman's or some sort of finishing knot here just below your bowline. Now me personally, I don't like this, and a number of other people also don't like this. One is because this could come loose and then the bowline could start to come loose. And if you're climbing all day on like a long multi-pitch, that can easily happen. Two is if you sit back in the rope, you can see how this knot sort of gets in the way of the knot going up. And if you have it tied further back, that can also push it up and make it loose. So one thing you can do is, here we go, so find your tail where it comes through in the knot, and then you can actually thread it back up through the tongue of the bowline. There we go. Yeah, it doesn't affect the way how the knot's tied. It just reorients the tail so that way it's going up with your main climbing rope. And then throw in your double fisherman's knot. And that does add a bit of security. You can see how it looks right here. And then the double fisherman's is to keep that knot from coming untied. Some people actually prefer to tie their bowline like this. Alright, another type of bowline you can use is the double bowline. And that's just adding an extra loop. So I'm going to pass the tail up through my harness. And then the way how I tie this is I go, here's the tail, I take the main strand and I just do a loop. Yep. And I make sure that the line coming from my harness is on top of the loop. And then I do another loop. Yeah, so it's getting all 3D now. You can see how I have 2 loops. And then I take the end of my rope and pass it up through the loops, around the tree, and then back down. There you go, I gotta maybe make it a bit nicer to clean it up. And now you can see I have 2 loops. 1, 2, going through the knot. And that's what we call a double bowline. This does add a bit more security in that it can cinch down on the tongue a bit more, and then the rope won't get, the knot won't go as loose on you. Again, some people will put the back up right here on the, like in between the knot and the harness. Or, again, most people will take the end and go back through the tongue, bring it up, and then tie their finishing knot above the knot, the bowline. Now this, among many circles, is considered a complete knot. And I guess foolproof as, you know, bowlines can get. You will see this used in many circles where they just pass this back through and then tie the knot. Now, there is the option of the Yosemite finish with bowlines, and this works for both single bowlines and double bowlines. However, it's not just passing the knot, the tail back through. That is not considered the Yosemite finish. What you actually have to do is pass this tail around your main strand right here and then back up through. So you can see how the finish is actually retracing this last end through. And then pull it nice and tight. You can see how it adds another loop right there. And then that's your Yosemite finish. Double bowline with a Yosemite finish. And quite a bit of tail. Actually, this is a little much tail. I would personally have a little less tail. Something along this amount. And then I would have the knot closer to my harness. This is the knot that I prefer to use when I'm doing hard sport climbing. Is the double bowline with the Yosemite finish. And that has been just fine for me, and it is a perfectly fine knot to use when I'm doing hard climbing. I won't really use this knot for really long routes. I prefer the figure-8 follow-through, just because that is more clean, it's easier to check, and it'll stay together longer. This one will still, unless I pull it real tight, it can loosen up on you. All bowlines will loosen up a bit more than figure-8s. Here's an example of a single bowline with the Yosemite finish. I have my single bowline here. I'm going to bring my tail up, pass it through this loop, then bring it around, and then retrace this line, main line going down to my belayer. Pull it through, pull everything nice and tight, and you can see how the single bowline works with, make sure that it follows that little J curve all the way back up into the tongue. And then I have a decent amount of tail. If you want to go the extra mile, you could even have your double bowline with a Yosemite finish, and then even tie a finishing knot above, some sort of double fisherman's, and that'll be extra secure. So if you really want to use the bowline but have the most amount of security, this is one of your options for sure. One other bowline I've seen that many people use, more of European people using it. First of all, the bowline is actually a lot more popular in Europe, whereas here in America we use the figure eight follow through. And in Europe you'll see the bowline a lot more utilized, but a lot of European people I've seen climbing, they'll take an extra long amount of tail from their harness and they'll just tie a single bowline. And then what they do is after their single bowline is done, they take the tail and pass it down through the opposite way they originally threaded through their harness. And then they'll actually retrace the bowline. So I'm going to go through here, bring it around, then straight up through. And so you can see every bit of the bowline is doubled except for the tongue right here. But I don't know if this has a specific name, maybe a bowline retrace, but it is a knot that'll work. And already includes the Yosemite finish, so this would be fine on its own, but a lot of folks will add in a knot above. They'll give themselves a bit more tail to make that a double fisherman's knot, but I've seen that used plenty of times and that catches people plenty of times, and a lot of people, this is their preferred method of bowline to tie. Another bowline you'll see when people are trying to tie into the middle of the rope, either when guiding or in groups of three, you mainly see this in the alpine world, is you find the middle of the rope, you can see my middle markers, and then that's your bight. You're going to tie a bowline on a bight. So take the bight and run it through the bottom loop and then the top loop of your harness. You know, pull a decent amount through, and then you're just going to tie a single bowline. There you go. It doesn't matter if this is super clean. If you want, you can take the time to make it clean, but it'll still do its job. And then now I have two strands that I can have going to each of my partners or clients. The only thing with this setup is that this is not a closed system. So you can run into the same problem with this getting loose and your tail popping through. So you can, if you have a long enough one, again, tie it back around. You could maybe do the Yosemite finish, but it is still a loop. So the best way to deal with this is to take a carabiner, a locking carabiner, and hook it off to either your gear loop, making sure that no matter which orientation the knot is in, it's not going to pull and break off your gear loop. Or if you have this a bit smaller, which I can do by just threading the rope through, you can take a locking carabiner and clip this off to your hard point on your harness, which is what I would prefer, because that keeps it all in one single place. And by having that locking carabiner there, you eliminate that chance of it popping through and killing yourself. Okay, so that pretty much covers all the different types of bowlines that we use in climbing. Again, you'll probably see tiny variations on what I showed you out there in the field. Sometimes there's a little bit different ideas with Yosemite finishes or tying off your knots that people will prefer, but that's getting into more stylistic stuff. I showed you basically the baseline of what you want if you're gonna tie them with a bowline, and I personally, I only use the bowline maybe about one out of every 20 times I tie in, just for hard sport climbs where I know I'm gonna fall and work a lot and I want a bit easier but not to untie at the end. Whenever I'm using or doing big routes, big long routes, then I will use a figure eight follow through, and I a lot of times will require my clients when I'm working with them to use a figure eight follow through, and I need to have a specific reason if I'm going to employ a bowline while working. It's not something that I do too much in rock stuff, but more in the alpine world. I hope you got something out of this video. If you have any personal preferences, always throw a comment in, and I'll see you guys in the next one.